What do we want? Real democracy! When do we want it? Now! What do we want? Real democracy! When do we want it? Now!
Welcome to Real Democracy Now. I'm Nivek Thompson, and Real Democracy Now is a podcast for people who think we can and should improve how democracy works. This podcast looks at democracy from different angles to help you think about how democracy might be improved. Welcome to episode 16 of season 1 of Real Democracy Now, a podcast. Season 1 has been focused on deliberative mini-publics, and in today's episode I am speaking to Professor James Fishkin. Professor Fishkin holds the Janet M. Peck Chair in International Communication at Stanford University, where he is also Professor of Communication, Professor of Political Science, and Director of the Centre for Deliberative Democracy. His work focuses on deliberative democracy and democratic theory in books such as When the People Speak, Deliberation Day, and Democracy and Deliberation. He first proposed deliberative polling as a method of public consultation in 1988. It has since been applied in more than 24 countries around the world, including, as you will hear today, on one occasion operating in 22 languages simultaneously. Professor Fishkin, you've taken a different approach to implementing deliberative mini-publics to most of the other academics and practitioners I've spoken with to date. Can you describe your approach, deliberative polling, and how you came about developing this method?
Well, I'm focused on the question, what would the people think under good conditions for really thinking about it? As a result, I need to make sure that the mini-public is representative in attitudes and demographics, and that we can evaluate that representativeness and that we can evaluate the opinion changes in a statistically meaningful way. Therefore, my mini-publics are mostly larger in size than the citizens' juries, consensus conferences, and other such designs. And secondly, we have decided to collect the considered judgments and the changes of opinion that is before and after deliberation in confidential questionnaires, rather than in some shared judgment like a jury verdict or a shared consensus. And the reason is that we think that the social pressure for consensus distorts the results, and we have some empirical evidence to establish that. So I think the main ways in which the deliberative poll differs from other mini-publics is, first, we do real random sampling, and some others do quota sampling or some kind of informal collection of a variety of people. And we do real random sampling in ways where we can evaluate the attitudinal as well as the demographic representativeness of the sample. So unlike some other practitioners, including some in Australia, who are just concerned about the demographics, we're concerned about the viewpoints and policy attitudes that people bring, because we want a kind of microcosm of the public, whether it's the public of a country, and we've done with Australian collaborators a couple of national projects in Australia, by the way, but also in 26 other countries around the world. So we're concerned about the representativeness so that we really in effect put the whole country in one room, but under conditions where it can think. Now, the conditions where it can think are the ones that we've come up with over the years are just really common sense. Our question is, what would the people think under good conditions? So the good conditions that we use are carefully vetted and balanced briefing materials vetted by an advisory group of experts and policymakers who really represent the competing points of view on the issue and would advocate very different solutions. So they vet the materials for balance and accuracy. Then we produce often a video version of the briefing materials, and we've been doing projects lately in sub-Saharan Africa where the populations are not literate enough to use written briefing materials, but they have great deliberations based upon video versions of the briefing materials, which we show at the beginning. Then we randomly assign the participants to moderated small group discussions. The small group discussions are led by trained moderators who give no hint of their own viewpoint on the issue, but they facilitate a mutually respectful, civil, and balanced discussion of the issues as laid out in the briefing materials, whether written or video. Then the small groups arrive at key questions that they want to ask panels of competing experts who represent different points of view on the policy topic being discussed. And the experts answer questions that were agreed on in the small groups. Nobody gives a speech. They just directly answer the questions, and we try to get competing answers to the same questions so people will understand the arguments on either side. We repeat this process often for an entire weekend, alternating small groups and plenary sessions until we work through the whole agenda that was agreed on at the beginning with the advisory group. And then people take the confidential questionnaire at the end, plus some evaluation questions, and we see the changes of opinion, if any. And overall, we think about of the questions, policy questions we've ever asked have changed significantly in the various deliberative polls around the world. So the design is different. It's different in the sense that it's somewhat more ambitious to really you can't represent a country with 26 people in a citizen jury, but you can represent a country with a few hundred in a deliberative poll, and you can evaluate the representativeness and evaluate the significance of the opinion changes if you collect the opinions at the individual level. We then further always have explanatory variables that help us understand why the people change. And that's really important because the end product of the process is a picture of the considered judgments of the public and an understanding of why and how they came to those judgments. What were the reasons that they supported a proposal? What were the reasons that they resisted a proposal? And those provide, we think, policymakers with a route to responsible advocacy, not misleading half-truths, but no, the advocacy based upon what really counts with the people when they think about it. So other designs that are too small to be statistically representative or that are that prize consensus and so distort the process have other problems. The problems that we have tended to we have shown systematically the project avoids are the distortions that would lead one to think the end results are not reasoning on the merits. The sort of ideal behind all of this is what Habermas called the unforced force of the better argument. Now, if the results are distorted by the rich dominating the poor, or the educated dominating the uneducated, or the men dominating the women, or whatever advantaged group you want to select, then it's not the unforced force of the better argument, but social deference or some other force that's distorting it. And juries often have that problem, but we have systematically shown in many deliberative polls that we do not have that problem. Secondly, another distortion is a pattern of group psychology, which Cass Sunstein calls polarization, where the groups go to extremes. If a group starts on the right of a continuum, they move further to the right. If they start to the left, they move further to the left. That is, the balance in the argument pool is shaped one way. They just keep moving that way. We don't have that. We've shown systematically that we have enough elements of balance in the process with the materials, the way the moderation is conducted, the balance in the panels of experts, et cetera, that half the time the mean opinion moves away from the center and half the time it moves towards the center. So it's not there's no pattern of group polarization at all in our project. And if there were, that would also raise questions about whether we were getting the unforced force of the better argument. Rather, it would be a kind of group conformity that is producing the result. But by allowing the opinions in confidential questionnaires, we avoid the pressures of group conformity. In fact, our participants never have to say where they really stand. They can always raise arguments as devil's advocate or just to express the other point of view so we can have it balanced. So there are reasons why our design is very different from the others. And there are reasons why it has been useful to policymakers around the world because it seems to maintain its credibility.
One of the things you mentioned there was, for instance, video information. What other ways has deliberative polling evolved since you started them? And perhaps when did you start developing the concept and the practice of deliberative polling?
I thought of it in 1988 and published it in the Atlantic Monthly. And I wanted to use it in the presidential campaign. I eventually got to use it in the presidential campaign in 1996. And in the meantime, I actually launched it in the United Kingdom with a series of projects with the television network Channel 4, beginning in 1994 on a national basis there. How has it evolved? Well, I think the main evolution has been in learning about the different contexts where this approach works well. I could never have envisioned this sequence of occasions and policy challenges where we can create an entry point for the informed and thoughtful views of the people to some either public dialogue or policy process. And so that's been the main evolution. There have been a few cases where we modified the approach slightly. The main one, I suppose, being a series of projects in sub-Saharan Africa, 2 in Uganda, 1 in Ghana, one national one in Tanzania, and most recently one in Senegal. And now I'm commuting to Malawi, where we're doing another one. And the main challenge there has been low education and literacy level of many of the sample, which, as I say, we've overcome well. And we've then shown, critics have thought that you couldn't do this kind of thing in sub-Saharan Africa. And in fact, the Africans reason very thoughtfully about issues affecting their communities. And they rightly expect the government and the policymakers and the donor agencies to do something about their problems and to listen to them as to which solutions would work. And I think we're finding great success there. We have done some purely online versions, initially just with voice and now with video, usually using Google Hangouts. And in other words, small group discussions, plenary sessions, the same basic format, but all online. And that has the merit of saving transportation costs and hotel costs. But it's less good for the media. It's less dramatic for the media. And so it gets less coverage, but it's perfectly defensible as a form of the process, provided you have a good sample and it works well. So that's definitely an important development in deliberative polling.
So you've touched on this a bit, but can you give me some examples of where, as you've said, around the world, deliberative polling has been utilised, and in particular, the outcomes of its use? How have the outcomes been used in different places and different countries?
Sure. I'll give you a few examples. We did a series of deliberative polls in Texas about the energy choices facing the state. Was it because Texas has been growing very fast, as you know, and so its need for electricity was growing greatly as well. And in the 8 different areas of the state that had regulated utilities, in each area, we did a deliberative poll whose recipient of the information was the Public Utility Commission. We did deliberative polls about should they get their future energy from coal, natural gas, renewable energy such as wind power or solar, or should they deal with the problem by increasing conservation, or perhaps in some cases transmitting the energy in from Mexico rather than providing new sources of energy. And a very striking result in all 8 projects was the increased support for people willing to pay a little bit more on their energy bill to ensure the investment in renewable energy, particularly wind power. And so the percentage of the public averaged over the 8 projects willing to pay more on its monthly bill went from, I think it was about 50% to 86%, something like that. It's more than 30 points. So it's a very large increase. And so the Public Utility Commission was very impressed by that. And they mandated large increases in wind power and very modest charges for the consumers, 25 cents a month per customer. But we could say, what was a quarter going to do? But there are millions and millions of quarters. And those amounts subsidized the investments in wind power and also fed into renewable energy portfolios that the state legislature considered based on the same data. And as a result of all that work, Texas was, when we started in 1996, Texas was last among the 50 states in terms of the amount of wind power. By 2007, Texas became first of all the 50 states in the amount of wind power, surpassing California. So that was a dramatic policy impact. And increasingly, the investment in wind power turned out to be cost effective anyway, didn't need subsidies, but it was farsighted to make those investments. And one of my graduate students looked at this in great detail in terms of the other explanatory variables we had and made a very good case modeling the fact that the citizens in Texas, when they discussed their problems together, became more public spirited. They were motivated. Instead of just focusing on their own personal utility bill, they were focused on the clean air for the whole community and the better environment for the whole community. So they were providing a public good for public-spirited reasons. And this reminded me of John Stuart Mill, who wrote about reacting to Tocqueville, wrote about the jury in the town meeting in the United States, and thought that when people discussed public problems together, they would become more sensitive to the public interest and be willing to do things on behalf of the public interest rather than their own personal interest. Mill recommended that there be more schools of public spirit, he called them, occasions where the people would take some responsibility and discuss the public problems together. And so the deliberative poll in Texas was like that. And we found the same thing, by the way, in China, where we've done a number of deliberative polls with local Chinese collaborators, and the Chinese have been using it at the local level to make decisions about what infrastructure projects to build and what their budgets should be on a yearly basis. We have an article about this called Deliberative Democracy in an Unlikely Place. It's also discussed in my book, When the People Speak. And in the Chinese case, we also showed that in the choice of projects, they became more public-spirited. The projects that would benefit the whole community were the ones that rose, and the ones that would just benefit their own area were the ones that didn't. And so it was very similar. And by the way, the use of deliberative polling in China has been sort of blessed at the highest level at the 18th Party Congress and in other times. And so it's a form of democracy that is flourishing in China, believe it or not, at the local level only. In Bulgaria, we did a project some years ago on the condition of the Roma, who, as you know, are the most discriminated group. There's more discrimination against them than any other group in Eastern Europe. And this was a big national project. The prime minister actually participated. And we had a national sample and included about the right percentage of Roma in the sample. And we dealt with several very difficult issues, including education, housing, because the Roma were living in ghettos, and the criminal justice system. And one of the most striking things is there was a dramatic change in the percentage of the Bulgarians who supported closing the Roma-only schools. The schools were segregated at that point, the Roma-only schools, and busing the Roma children to schools with everybody else. And that has actually now happened, and our Bulgarian colleagues support the idea that we helped catalyze that process. It was a long, difficult process, but the Roma schools are now desegregated. And this sort of came as a big surprise in the media at the time that the public in Bulgaria would be willing to accept that. When we showed up, there was such hostility to the Roma at the political fringes, at least, that one political party took the occasion to announce that its policy towards the Roma would be to send them all to the moon. So in that context, we showed that real, thoughtful, mutually respectful dialogue was possible, and people could understand in the interests of the children in the future that if the Roma children went to their own schools and they didn't even learn the Bulgarian language, what job prospects would they ever have? And how could they be, self-sustaining members of the community? So I'm very proud of that one.
That one raises for me a really interesting question, and that is how, and you've mentioned the role of the media before, even though you've got a large sample in deliberative polling processes, how do you get the knowledge and the changing of opinions that have happened in a deliberative polling process communicated more widely and accepted in the broader community who perhaps haven't been through that process?
First of all, we have the results before and after, and hopefully we can identify the reasons for the results. Secondly, if we have willing media partners, we broadcast the process as well as the results so people can see. The media partners will tape some of the small groups. They'll tape plenary sessions. There will be all kinds of outreach to the public. And the result is what I call a route to responsible advocacy, because if you can really identify the reasons why opinion changes, those reasons should have weight with the broader public if properly expressed. And it becomes a bit of a news event. You can get coverage before, during, and after the process. I'll give you another example. In, I think it was 2011, we did a project in Japan on the potential reform of the pension system. And Japan, as you know, is getting very old. And so the government at the time, the DPJ government, was interested in privatizing the pension system. Although they had a somewhat misleading name for it. They were going to call it the funded system because each person would have his or her own fund. And in polling at the time, there was widespread support for the funded system proposal. It was about 70%. And they were moving towards it. And as it happened, our Japanese collaborator, Professor Sone at Keio University, managed to get a grant from the equivalent of the National Science Foundation in Japan to do a national deliberative poll on reform of the pension system. And he enlisted media partners, and we were intensively involved. And support for the so-called funded system basically dropped in half when people thought about it. They didn't want the risk of putting their savings in the market. And instead, but Japan is a very special place in terms of people really prizing privacy. It's very difficult, for example, to do telephone polling there. And so there were a bunch of alternatives, but basically it came down to the idea that if they were going to increase a tax, find a tax that could support the the current pay-as-you-go pension system, it would have to be a tax that involved no invasion of privacy. And so there was such a tax, which was very low at the time. It was the consumption tax. So there was a big increase in support for raising the consumption tax if the money would go to support the pension system. And that was basically the route to policy change that the Japanese government adopted, rather than privatizing. So that's another example where we think we had an effect.
Yeah.
We outlined the logic of what change was suitable and what change was not, and broadcast it widely.
That sort of actually leads into another question I had, and that was one of the aspects of deliberative polling that I've always wondered about is how you design the survey questions, so that, you know, the pre and the post, and whether participants can develop new or novel responses to an issue. And I just wondered, I mean, did someone know at the beginning of that process that the consumption tax might be an option? How would that have actually, was that on the agenda beforehand? It's just...
One of the things we do, if you're going to show differences pre and post, you need to ask the questions pre and post, because one thing we don't have is a time machine. So we get the Stakeholder Advisory Committee to work very hard on thinking of all the possible viable policy solutions to the problem that could be asked in the questionnaire. And while nobody paid much attention to it, some of the advisors did think that that was worth considering. It just wasn't what the direction the government seemed to be moving towards at the time. So that was envisioned beforehand. It's just we were surprised by the result. Now, we also we didn't in that Japanese case, but we have in many other cases, and now we mostly always do it. We tape all the small group discussions so that we get all the nuances and qualitative information from, there might be 25 or 30 small groups meeting for an entire weekend, and we have all of that material to analyze as well. And there have been one or two occasions where something came up that was so dramatic, though I can't really remember, but I just have the sense that is what we would do. If something really, let me put it this way, if something really came up that was dramatic as a policy option, I think this happened in a local project in China as a possible solution. We included we added to the final questionnaire, even though we don't have a pre-survey.
I see.
But what we're really interested in is the pre and post. Because we're interested in the opinion change, we have to anticipate beforehand.
Yeah, so that's obviously a fair bit of work goes into the preparation to...
Yeah. The more work that goes into the preparation, the more likely the result's going to be worthwhile. And the more all the key stakeholders and policymakers will buy into the project at the beginning, so they'll be interested in what comes out at the end.
And is there, from your perspective and years and years of experience, are there particular topics or issues or situations which work really well with deliberative polling and ones that don't, or is it something that you see can work in most situations?
Well, the important thing is that it should be a question of collective political will. So it's not a technical question. I mean, if it's just a technical question about means and ends, which version of the space shuttle is going to work better, you need experts. But if it's a question of, do we want manned spaceflight or not, and under what conditions and what risks, then you can consult the people about it. But you have to boil the question down so that there are competing values and trade-offs, and they're made as clear as possible. And that's a question of collective political will, not a question of, not just a technical question. So that's the key. And it can be a hot issue, it can be a cold issue, but it should be, what is the policy that we want to adopt and why, or why not?
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Is there anything else that you would like to share with people in an episode that's specifically dedicated to deliberative polling that I haven't really drawn out?
There's a few more contexts to describe. We've done this now in, as I say, sub-Saharan Africa, where people thought it couldn't be done. We've done this in throughout the entire European Union, in Brussels with a sample representing what was then all 27 countries, twice in 22 languages at the same time, with overcoming the issues of translation. We've done this in virtual space that is online. I think the main thing for me is that democracy should be, in my view, about the will of the people. And our normal approach to democracy, party competition-based electoral democracy, does not facilitate as much as I would like the will of the people, because parties are interested in winning. They're not interested in informing and engaging the public. They're interested in mobilizing and, if necessary, manipulating the public. I think that we need deliberative polling or something like it to engage a public voice and then find ways to insert it into our democratic processes. So we did a project in California which was designed to pilot the idea of the people deliberating about what could go on the agenda for an initiative, because the initiative process right now is determined by who can raise the millions of dollars necessary for signature collecting to get something on the ballot. Why not have a public interest proposition that is motivated by the people's considered judgments? And so that's one entry point, agenda setting. Another entry point would be recommendations to a commission. So those cases in Texas where recommendations to the Public Utility Commission. Another would be recommendations to a legislature. It turned out that our California project, while it did get something on the ballot, had its main effect by recommendations that were brought to the legislature as they reformed the initiative process, because the people were very concerned about getting transparency in who was paying for the initiatives. And the people were very concerned about allowing some flexibility when an initiative was formulated and signatures were collected, and then it was found that it had a flaw, a legal flaw, and would have unexpected consequences. They wanted a formal process where it could be revised and improved. And those things actually went into a bill that was passed and approved by the legislature. So that was a policy effect in California. But the idea was we were recommending to the legislature. In Mongolia, we did this big project for the capital city of Ulaanbaatar. That project provided the people's recommendations to the executive, the city government, the mayor's office, about which projects were worth borrowing a lot of money for in order to build the future, which projects in the city's master plan. So that was another way to get input from the people to decision makers. And those were, by the way, adopted. One thing to note is that very often, very well-meaning policymakers may not be in touch with the people at a detailed level because they talk to the lobbyists, they talk to the people who reach them. So the mayor of Ulaanbaatar thought the people would want the metro that the Japanese were hoping that they would build. And in fact, what the people really wanted was, on the list of about 30 projects, what the people really wanted was proper heating and installation in the schools. You know, Ulaanbaatar is the coldest capital city in the world. When we did our project there, it was 35 degrees below zero. And you might say, is that Fahrenheit or centigrade? It doesn't matter. At minus 35, they cross. It's the same thing. And it's very cold. But that's what the people wanted. He had no idea that's what the people had as their first choice. And so they actually did they actually adopted the top 10 projects out of the 30 that the people wanted. I mean, they adopted them in the order that the people specified. But the metro was not high on the list. It actually sank to near the bottom. And the mayor had actually said in public statements that he thought that was the metro he hoped they would build. But no, it went down to the bottom. In the Chinese case, the local party leader in the first deliberative poll in China, the local party leader had wanted the image projects. He thought that Fancy Town Square that he wanted to build would be the top project. And what the people really wanted was clean water. and sewage treatment plants. And they got those. And he was very well appreciated for that. But he didn't know that that's what the people wanted. And if you're a policymaker, think of it that way. How are you going to hear what the people wanted? Because what the people want. If you do polls, the public only has a top of the head impression of they haven't really thought about the issue. If you do open meetings, you'll be flooded by organized groups or lobbyists. But if you do a deliberative poll, you have something that is representative and thoughtful. And in Uganda, the district leaders had thought that they were consolidating the schools in order to build bigger and better schools, and they were consolidating the health care in order to build bigger and better health care centers with more technology. But the new schools and the new health care centers were much farther away. And in the region where we were, in the Mount Elgon region in Uganda, which it's greatly overpopulated, has very high population density, the women would not consider family planning anymore because the health care was too far away. If you have to walk 2 hours or 3 hours to get to a health care facility, it's too far to be reliable. And they stopped sending the girls to school at all because they were afraid in order to walk that far to the schools, they might be molested on the way. And so they were just keeping the girls home. So it had a tremendous effect on the women and the girls to make these decisions, which if you were the district governors, it might seem from that perspective to be very thoughtful. Let's have bigger, more modern, better schools, bigger, more modern, better healthcare facilities. But they were out of touch with the people they were supposedly serving. So when we presented the results, they were really impressed by those results. And we had the quantitative results and we had the qualitative results because we had the taped transcripts of all the discussions. So we were able to make a definitive case that was representative of the population. That's a way of connecting the people in microcosm to the policymakers. So I think that's the kind of a function that deliberative polling is able to serve.
And are most of the deliberative polls that you're involved with or aware of, are they actually commissioned by the decision makers, or is there a mix of sponsors for these processes?
It's a mix. For example, in Ulaanbaatar, we worked with the Asia Foundation, who worked with the city government, and the Asia Foundation solicited funding from various donor agencies and governments, including Australia, by the way, which I'm very grateful for, helped sponsor the deliberative poll in Ulaanbaatar, which turned out to be a big success. But there was, in other words, the Asia Foundation was an intermediary there. Sometimes there are foundations, sometimes there are broadcasters, but usually the governments are involved either explicitly or providing members of the advisory committee. Our Africa project have been sponsored by the USAID, and so that's the American government has sponsored those. They sponsored the projects in the two in Uganda, the one in Ghana, and the one in Senegal.
I learned a lot speaking to Professor Fishkin, and I hope you did too. In next week's episode, I'll be talking to 4 everyday people who have participated in deliberative mini-publics in Australia, Canada, and the UK. I look forward to you joining me then. I ask all my guests what they think is the essence of a real democracy. If you haven't already listened to episode 9, that's where you can hear what my first 12 guests thought. I'd also like to share with you what a listener, Andy Pace, who is a facilitator, coach and mindfulness trainer from London, sees as the essence of a real democracy. For Andy, the essence of a real democracy is the capacity of citizens to self-organise and co-create a collectively meaningful future. Systems and processes that integrate all voices and perspectives without discrimination or preference. Its results are outcomes that people feel they own themselves. Thanks, Andy. I'd love to know what you think is the essence of a real democracy. You can let me know on Facebook or Twitter, or by sending an email to essence@realdemocracynow.com.au. And if you're good with technology, why not record a voice memo with your take on the essence of real democracy? Email it to me so I can play it on a future episode of the podcast. Thanks for listening to Real Democracy Now! You can find more about today's topic in the show notes at www.realdemocracynow.com.au. If you enjoyed this program, please subscribe to this podcast, write a review, share the podcast with your friends, and join the conversation on the webpage or on Facebook or Twitter. I'd love to know what you think is the essence of a real democracy.